What does your crazy neighbor do? To be labeled the crazy neighbor. Story 1. Eats my flowers. In his defense, he told us that he has been doing it for years when he introduced himself after we bought the house. He also brought over frozen cookies in a plastic bag as a housewarming gift, but wasn't sure what was in them. We share a side yard, and he is a really great neighbor. Just an older, quiet guy who keeps to himself and eats my flowers. Comes over to my yard and eats the lilies raw, or brings scissors and clips the heads to boil and make jam. I thought that his particular foraging was interesting and quirky, so I planted a couple raspberry, blackberry, and blueberry bushes 3 years ago. When we first moved in, on the side yard we share, I told him to help himself to berries any time, especially before the birds do. The bushes have all gone insane, and the entire side of my house is now a summerberry haven for us to share. Having a decent relationship with the guy I share a property line with is worth some dead-headed flowers. Story 2. My neighbor was an 85-year-old widow that lived alone. She had 2 vehicles, a car and truck, and over the course of a few months I realized that she was no longer parking her car in her garage, like she had for the many years prior to that. Then suddenly the truck wasn't being parked inside the garage either. Turns out she no longer had room in her garage to park her vehicles because she was walking down to a residential construction site about a block away every evening, and she'd grab 2 2x4s and bring them home. She had over 500 boards stacked in her garage, and when she was questioned on what she was going to do with it, she didn't have an answer. Story 3. This older lady lives across the street from me, and she is obsessed with leaves falling on her lawn, to the point that she will come out of her house and pick up one individual leaf off the grass in the fall or any other time. She spends hours a day outside with the leaf blower in fall. She will go and knock on other neighbors' doors if she thinks you have too many leaves on your grass. She'll come over into your yard and do it herself if you're not home. What I think is weird is that she's in her 70s, no kids or grandkids living with her, and lives alone in a pretty large 4-bedroom house with an amazing in-ground pool in the backyard, with a slide and diving board and everything. Nobody has used that pool in at least 5 years yet. She opens it up every summer. Somehow she likes my family and has never once yelled at us about our leaves, and randomly brings things over like half-eaten gallons of ice cream and asks if we want it because she's not using it. Story 4. Used to live in a little town of 300 people where we had an elderly neighbor named Gladys. She would routinely look near our garbage can outside and take the recyclable bottles and cans we would leave for her. After we cleaned out the fish tank, we put the gravel and fake plants in a bag and left it on top of the garbage can because it was already full. About a week later, Gladys hollered at me while I was outside to come over as she wanted to show me something. She had taken that bag we had left and planted the fake plants along the side of her house. She said she wasn't really confident that they would make it, but so far they seemed to be thriving. I could only nod and compliment her on her green thumb. Story 5. Well, I used to have a neighbor who was legitimately mentally ill, although I don't know his actual diagnosis. His truck wouldn't start one day, dead battery, and he told everyone on the street that another neighbor was stealing the electricity. He knew this because of the way this guy parked his vehicle. Obviously, it was sucking electricity from the ground for his battery, which drained the car batteries near him. Many times he would run down the street and warn everyone to hide their valuables because Japan was invading the country. He wasn't on D's, but he did take medication for his mental illness, and everyone on our street could tell when he stopped taking it. Whenever he would start saying completely irrational things, we would remind him to take his medication, and he would thank us and go home, presumably to take it. He lived alone, and he was getting older, so I think he had a hard time remembering to take it. There were many more incidents. Story 6. This guy is weird as hell. Okay, so he plays VR in a large bunny onesie, like the kind the kid gets in A Christmas Story, which you know is cool. I guess you do. But he plays with his window open so everyone can see him, and on top of that he plays, from what I can tell, exclusively military sims and never breaks character. You can hear him yelling stuff like, "Contact 30 clicks south by southwest," or "Stuff down reloading, ready up." The guy will throw himself to the ground, and I mean throw himself. The few times I've spoken to him or seen him in person, he's had bruises on his arms and face from hitting the ground. And that's only what I can see from his window. Other than that, at night, you can hear guys grinding, hammering, and drilling on something. I don't know, he's a weird dude. He says he works for the government and does contractor work. He has really nice stuff, expensive stuff, and new vehicles all the time. He can't carry on a conversation. Starts getting nervous and will break away as soon as he can. He was home for a few weeks and said he was in between contracts, and I managed to talk to him a bit while he was setting stuff outside. That stuff he was laying out. A rucksack that had seen some heavy use in everything from medical and survivalist camping gear to empty magazine holders and a plate holder for bullet-resistant plates. He said he was letting them air out since he was planning on going on a backpacking trip for a few weeks. Weirdest part is he leaves almost every night between 9-10 p.m. Probably to get some of the junk food he'll leave in his car occasionally, but every night? I like to think the guy's a secret agent and uses the VR thing as an excuse to explain away bruises and cuts. Either way, I feel sorta safe. He's genuinely nice when he does talk to you, just in that I haven't spoken to another human being for years kind of way. You go Secret Agent Bunny, saving the world one hop at a time. Story 7. I cared for an elderly woman for many years. She lived to the age of 93 in a crime-ridden inner-city neighborhood, by being as tough and nasty as any criminal living nearby. Her oddest actions involved her incorrect belief that she owned the road in front of her house. She didn't even own a car, but she insisted that nobody parked there. She would confront them if they parked in front of her house. If they did it again, she slashed their tires in the middle of the night. Over and over for years, she was never caught, but everybody knew it was her. She only stopped when she lost the physical strength to slash a tire in her mid-80s. Then she started using spray paint on the cars. "He doesn't park in front of my house anymore," was all the justification she needed to damage her neighbor's cars. Story 8. The neighbor behind us had a leak in his water pipe, and rather than fix it, he just had the sump pump drain it out into the backyard. This meant that all year round the back of our yard was a little bit damp. Eventually, the leaky pipe burst and filled the house with 5 feet of water. His solution to this was just to keep the pump running and flood the entire neighborhood. After about an hour, a posse of all the neighbors whose yards were being flooded confronted him and called the city to shut off the water. The city fixed the water pipe and the neighbor ended up with a large fine. At least my yard stays basically dry now. I should also mention that this neighbor once rented the house out to a bunch of crackheads, and it nearly burned down because the ex-girlfriend of one of these morons snuck in and set the house on fire. Story 9. I used to rent the basement apartment of the neighborhood crazy lady. Her car was decorated with thousands of rocks that she glued all over it. The property was incredibly overgrown. She had 5 unlicensed dogs to 2 cats, turtles that lived in her bathtub, pigeons, chickens, a rooster, and more animals that I can't specifically remember, but I do remember counting them all up. She had something like 17 animals upstairs. She regularly practiced saxophone while the dogs howled along with her. She didn't have a job and spent every day going on Craigslist free and picking things up. There was a room in the basement where she kept all of the stuff that was 3 to 4 feet deep and completely packed. I remember a cardboard stand-up of Captain Kirk and one of the Statue of Liberty sticking out of the hoard. I desperately took a job as a door-to-door solicitor for a short time and was randomly assigned to my neighborhood. When I introduced myself to the next-door neighbor and said what house I lived in, they were about ready to wring my neck, haha. I told them, yeah, it probably sucks living next to her, but I actually lived there, so yeah, no sympathy. Story 10. This woman lived next to us who needed to have the police called on her at least once a week. She would scream at her roommate at all hours of the night, go into a drunken and sometimes narco-filled stupor, and scream at us while tripping out as we sat in our backyard. More than once I had to kick her out of our home because she walked in unannounced, beer in hand, and drunk as ever. One time I called the police because she was screaming about finishing someone and rolling around on her front lawn. Another time I received a call at work, 1 in the morning as I worked 3rd shift. My girlfriend informed me they had to evacuate the house because the neighbor's garage was on fire. Turned out either she or her roommate had done it while doing D's or smoking in the garage. She ended up moving away but would still walk to our house to ask for our lawnmower. She was not happy when I told her to get off my porch. Story 11. I had a neighbor who would sneak into my yard at night and roll up my sod. It would be laid perfectly the night before, but I'd get up in the morning and it would be rolled up just like it was when it came from the store. I finally got pissed and spent the night laying by my back door with a baseball bat and a flashlight, ready to bonk the crap out of whoever it was. Sure enough, they came around 2 in the morning, and I stood up, turned the light on, and was face to face with 4 raccoons rolling up my sod, looking for bugs. Story 12. Well, before I moved back into the house, Our tenant thought he saw our neighbor watching his daughters and decided to stab the neighbor. So anyways, we came to the house and it looked like we had to get new sliding glass doors and front doors, since the police broke them down to get to my tenant. It is his second offense, so he is in prison for life. So my neighbors probably thought my tenant is the crazy one. Story 13. We used to live next to a woman that would have a disco party for her cats in her backyard at 2 a.m. every few nights. She would put up a disco ball and party lights with music playing. It was a little bit odd, but what made it crazy was her dancing like a Native American performing a ritual around the disco ball. It's honestly one of the strangest things I've ever witnessed. Story 14. My parents' next-door neighbor Nancy started with the no trespassing sign in the backyard that faces our yard and nothing else. Set up a motion-activated floodlight that faces the side of our house and nothing else. She stabbed our ball when it landed in her yard when we were children. Called the cops on the neighbors because their dog barked constantly despite them not owning a dog. Thanks my mother, the sweetest person you can meet in this world, is a backstabbing traitor for warning the new neighbors not to let their kids play on Nancy's lawn. Verbally assaulted me for chasing deer out of our flower garden, etc., but the true psycho moment came with the trees. We have large trees along the property line, just barely on our side, and she was starting to go all psycho about the tree is gonna fall and crush her house and demanding it be cut down. We consulted an arborist who said it did not, but could use a trim that would make it impossible to fall on her yard at all. The entire time they were trimming, she stalked the property line and screamed if anyone stepped over it. While this trim was happening, a single stick fell on her lawn. She lost it, threatened to call the cops, told them they'd better have all their licenses up to date, etc. Arborists tried to blow her off, but my mom insisted they check. Sent someone to City Hall and renew their license. 30 minutes after that, a cop showed up to check as Nancy had called them. Arborists were super thankful for my mom warning them. Story 15. Ours is the classic retired old man, in terrible health, and literally nothing going on in his life. He's not married, and I try to stay out of everyone's business, but I don't believe he has any kids. Rarely has visitors. I think he had a dream once of being a police officer but never quite made it. So he's taken it upon himself to be the neighborhood police person. He spies on everyone and makes it his business to know everything. My favorite encounter was catching him literally camping out in my front yard bushes early morning, spying on neighbors a few doors down. He had a coffee mug, notepad, and blanket, literally just hanging out in my front yard making notes about the weird folks who were likely doing D's at home. When I asked him what he was doing, he just didn't seem to understand that it was inappropriate. He seems to like us, so it's nice, I guess, but he creeps me out. Story 16. I used to live next to a screaming guy. It was a cheap apartment, and hearing through the walls didn't take a lot of effort. He would yell pretty regularly on the phone, TV, something. We could never figure out what it was. He lived alone and didn't have any pets we were aware of. The complex didn't allow them, and we never saw any. It was always during the day, and we could never find sporting events that corresponded to the yelling times. He was always polite and soft-spoken when we interacted with him in person. Story 17. We have a neighbor we call the Screamer Lady, because when her kids were young, she would basically sit at her window and run out and scream at anyone driving by if she felt they were going too fast, ranting about the safety of her children, who may or may not even be home at that point in the day. To this day, she still sits and studies traffic and glares at motorcycles. Her kids are grown, thankfully, so the screaming has ceased. Story 18. I saw the neighbor across the street, a woman who looked to be about 45 or 50, and had only been living there a few weeks, wander into her next-door neighbor's house while they weren't home, wearing no shirt, just of underclothing, and then like 5 minutes walk out muttering to herself, nothing in her hands or anything. She kept walking in circles in her driveway, muttering. She lived by herself, and this was concerning to me, so I called 911. Cops showed up and talked to her. During that time, the owners of that house showed up, and I told them what happened. They said nothing had been disturbed or anything, and they had never talked to that woman before. Shortly after that, an ambulance showed up, took the woman away, and I never saw her again. Like a month later, some people showed up to take her things out of her house. Story 19. Former crazy neighbor here, I 23 at the time, lived alone in a basement unit in a not great part of town. My bedroom windows, being in the basement, lined up directly with a very busy street filled with bars and lots of traffic. While smoking cigarettes on my stoop, I often had a knife or baseball bat physically with me. To my neighbors, I often referred to a live-in boyfriend often, even though I lived alone. At times I would go as far as yelling at my fake boyfriend in my apartment when I heard other people in the hallway, storming out of the apartment and telling my neighbors what an idiot my boyfriend was. All my neighbors believe I didn't live alone. Story 20. My crazy neighbor yells out his window about finishing the kids next door to him. The cops show up. He goes on meds for a few months and is fine. Then he randomly starts up again with the yelling. It's great. One time, he threw a bucket of his pee out into the middle of the road while yelling at me that he wanted to have relations with my dog. That's a wrap for this video. Make sure to leave your relatable story down in the comments. I would love to make a video on them. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.